Chapter 5. Back at his father's house, he went down the narrow steps from the kitchen to the basement, past the furnace, past the small water heater. The door to PJ's old room was warped by humidity and age. It squealed against the jamb and scraped across the sill as Joey forced it open. Rain beat on the two narrow horizontal casement windows that were set high in one basement wall, and the deep shadows were not dispersed by the meager stormlight. He flicked the switch by the door and a bare overhead bulb came on. The small room was empty. Many years ago, the single bed and the other furniture must have been sold to raise a few dollars. For the past 2 decades, when PJ came home, he had slept in Joey's room on the second floor because there had been no chance that Joey would pay a visit and need it himself. Dust, cobwebs, low on the walls a few dark patches of mildew like Rorschach blots. The only items of proof that remained of PJ's long-ago residence were a couple of movie posters for flicks so trashy that the advertising art had an unintentionally campy quality. They were thumbtacked to the walls, pus yellow with age, cracked, curling at the corners. In high school, PJ's dream was to get out of Asherville, out of poverty, and become a filmmaker. "But I need these," he had once said to Joey, indicating the posters, "to remind me that success at any price isn't worth it. In Hollywood, you can become rich and famous and celebrated even for making stupid, dehumanizing crap. If I can't make it by doing worthwhile work, I hope I've got the courage to give up the dream altogether instead of selling out." Either fate had never given PJ his shot at Hollywood, or he had lost interest in filmmaking somewhere along the way. Ironically, he had achieved fame as a novelist, fulfilling Joey's dream after Joey had abandoned it. PJ was a critically acclaimed writer, using his ceaseless rambles back and forth across the United States as material. He produced highly polished prose that had mysterious depths under a deceptively simple surface. Joey envied his brother, but not with any malice. PJ earned every line of the praise that he received and every dollar of his fortune, and Joey was proud of him. Theirs had been an intense and special relationship when they were young, and it was still intense, though it was now conducted largely at great distances by phone, when PJ called from Montana, or Maine, or Key West, or a small dusty town in the high plains of Texas. They saw each other no more than once every 3 or 4 years, always when PJ dropped in unannounced in the course of his travels. But even then, he didn't stay long, never more than 2 days, usually 1. No one had ever meant more to Joey than PJ, and no one ever would. His feelings for his brother were rich and complex, and he would never be able to explain them adequately to anyone. The rain hammered the lawn just beyond the ground-level windows of the basement. In a place so far above that it seemed to be another world, more thunder crashed. He had come to the cellar for a jar, but the room was utterly empty except for the movie posters. On the concrete floor near his shoe, a fat black spider seemed to materialize from thin air. It scurried past him. He didn't step on it, but watched it race for cover until it disappeared into a crack along the baseboard. He switched off the light and went back into the furnace room, leaving the warped door open. Climbing the stairs almost to the kitchen, Joey said, "Jar, what jar?" Puzzled, he stopped and looked down the steps to the cellar. A jar of something. A jar for something? He couldn't remember why he had needed a jar, or what kind of jar he had been seeking. Another sign of dementia. He'd been too long without drink. Plagued by the persistent uneasiness and disorientation that he'd felt since first entering Asherville the previous day, he went upstairs. He turned off the cellar lights behind him. His suitcase was packed and standing in the living room. He carried the bag onto the front porch, locked the door, and put the key back under the hemp mat where he had found it less than 24 hours ago. Something growled behind him, and he turned to confront a mangy, rain-soaked black dog on the porch steps. Its eyes were as fiercely yellow as sulphurous coal fires, and it bared its teeth at him. "Go away," he said. Not threateningly, but softly. The dog growled again, lowered its head, and tensed as if it might spring at him. "You don't belong here any more than I do," Joey said, standing his ground. The hound looked uncertain, shivered, licked its chops, and at last retreated. With his suitcase, Joey went to the head of the porch steps and watched the dog as it hunched away into the slanting sheets of gray rain, gradually fading as though it had been a mirage. When it moved around the corner and out of sight at the end of the block, he could easily have been convinced that it had been another hallucination. Chapter 6. The lawyer conducted business from the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, above the Old Town Tavern. The barroom was closed on Sunday afternoon, but small neon signs for Rolling Rock and Pabst Blue Ribbon still glowed in its windows, brightly enough to tint the rain green and blue as it fell past the glass. The law offices of Henry Kadinska occupied 2 rooms off a dimly lighted hallway that also served a real estate office and a dentist. The door stood open to the reception room. Joey stepped inside and said, "Hello." The inner door was ajar, and from beyond it a man responded, "Please, come in, Joey." The second room was larger than the first, although still of modest proportions. Law books lined 2 walls. On another, a pair of diplomas hung crookedly. The windows were covered with wood-slat Venetian blinds of a type that probably had not been manufactured in 50 years, revealing horizontal slices of the rainy day. Identical mahogany desks stood at opposite ends of the room. At one time, Henry Kadinska had shared the space with his father, Lev, who had been the town's only lawyer before him. Lev had died when Joey was a senior in high school. Unused but well-polished, the desk remained as a monument. Putting his pipe in a large cut-glass ashtray, Henry rose from his chair, reached across the desk, and shook Joey's hand. "I saw you at Mass, but I didn't want to intrude." "I didn't notice anyone," Joey said. "How are you doing?" "Okay. I'm okay." They stood awkwardly for a moment, not sure what to say. Then Joey sat in one of the 2 commodious armchairs that faced the desk. Kadinska settled back into his own chair and picked up his pipe. He was in his mid-50s, slightly built, with a prominent Adam's apple. His head seemed somewhat too large for his body, and this disproportionateness was emphasized by a hairline that receded 4 or 5 inches from his brow. Behind his thick glasses, his hazel eyes seemed to have a kindly aspect. "You found the house key where I told you?" Joey nodded. "The place hasn't changed all that much, has it?" Henry Kadinska asked. "Less than I expected. Not at all, really. Most of his life, your dad didn't have any money to spend, and when he finally got some, he didn't know how to spend it." He touched a match to his pipe and drew on the mouthpiece. "Drove PJ crazy that Dan wouldn't use much of what he gave him." Joey shifted uneasily in his chair. "Mr. Kadinska, I don't understand why I'm here. Why did you need to see me?" "PJ still doesn't know about your dad." "I've left messages on the answering machine in his New York apartment, but he doesn't really live there. Only for a month or so each year." The pipe was fired up again. The air was redolent of cherry-scented tobacco. In spite of the diplomas and books, the room wasn't much like an average law office. It was a cozy place, shabby genteel but cozy. Slumped in his chair, Henry Kadinska seemed to be as comfortable in his profession as he might have been in a pair of pajamas. "Sometimes," Joey said, "he doesn't call that number for days, even a week or 2. Funny way to live, nearly always on the road, but I guess it's right for him. He seems to thrive on it." "And it results in those wonderful books," said Kadinska. "Yes, I dearly love PJ's books. Virtually everyone does. There's a marvelous sense of freedom in them, such a spirit. Mr. Kadinska, the weather being as bad as it is, I'd like to get started back to Scranton as soon as possible. I have to catch a commuter flight out of there early in the morning." "Of course, yes," said Kadinska, with an unmistakable note of disappointment. Abruptly, he seemed to be a lonely little man who had only hoped for some friendly conversation. While the lawyer opened a file drawer on his desk and searched for something, Joey noticed that one of the crookedly hung diplomas was from Harvard Law. That was a wildly unlikely alma mater for a small-town, coal-country lawyer. Not all the shelves were filled with law books, either. Many were volumes of philosophy: Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Kant, Augustine, Kierkegaard, Bentham, Santayana, Schopenhauer, Empedocles, Heidegger, Hobbes, and Francis Bacon. Perhaps Henry Kadinska wasn't comfortable with being a small-town lawyer, but was simply long resigned to it, first trapped in the orbit of his father, and then by the gravity of habit. Sometimes, especially in a whiskey haze, it was easy for Joey to forget that he himself wasn't the only person in the world whose dearest dreams had come to nothing. "Your father's last will and testament," said Kadinska as he opened a file folder on his desk. "A reading of the will?" Joey asked. "I think PJ should be here for that, not me." "On the contrary, the will has nothing to do with PJ. Your father left everything to you. A sickening pang of guilt quivered through Joey. Why would he do that? You're his son. Why wouldn't he? Joey made a point of meeting the attorney's eyes. On this one day, even if never again, he wanted to be honest about these matters, to conduct himself with the dignity of which his father would have approved. We both know the hard answer to that, Mr. Kadinska. I broke his heart. Broke my mother's heart, too. More than 2 years she withered from the cancer, but I never came. Never held her hand. Never consoled my dad. Never saw him once in the last 20 years of his life. I called maybe 6 or 8 times, no more than that. Half the time he didn't know how to reach me because I didn't always give him my address or phone number, and when he did have my number, I always kept an answering machine switched on so I wouldn't have to pick up. I was a rotten son, Mr. Kadinska. I'm a drunk, a selfish shit, and a loser, and I don't deserve any inheritance, no matter how little it is. Henry Kadinska appeared to be pained to hear any man criticize himself so mercilessly. You're not drunk now, Joey, and the man I see before me isn't bad in his heart. I'll be drunk by tonight, sir, I assure you, Joey said quietly. And if you can't see me the way I describe myself, then you're a lousy judge of character. You don't know me at all, and you should count that as a blessing. Kadinska put his pipe in the glass ashtray again. Well, your father was a forgiving man. He wanted everything to go to you. Getting to his feet, Joey said, No, I can't take it. I don't want it. He started toward the door to the outer room. Wait, please, said the lawyer. Joey stopped and turned to him. The weather's miserable, and I've got a long drive out of these mountains to Scranton. Still slumped in his chair, picking up his pipe again, Henry Kadinska said, Where do you live, Joey? You know, Las Vegas. That's where you got hold of me. I mean, where do you live in Las Vegas? Why? I'm a lawyer. I've spent my life asking questions, and it's hard to change this late in the game. Indulge me. I live in a trailer park. One of those upscale parks with a community swimming pool and tennis courts? Old trailers, Joey said bluntly. Mostly real old. No pool? No tennis? Hell, not even any grass. What do you do for a living? I'm a blackjack dealer. Run roulette wheels sometimes. You work regularly? When I need to. When the drinking doesn't get in the way. When I can, Joey amended, remembering his promise to himself to deal with all of this truthfully. Pays well with the tips from the players. I can save up for when I have to take some time off. I do okay. But with your work record always moving on, you don't find jobs in the new flashy casinos very often anymore. Not often, Joey agreed. Each job is in a seedier place than the one before. For a man who sounded so compassionate a minute ago, you sure are showing a cruel streak all of a sudden. Kadinska's face reddened with embarrassment. I'm sorry, Joey, but I'm just trying to make the point that you're not exactly in a position to walk away from an inheritance. Joey was quietly adamant. I don't deserve it, don't want it, won't take it. That's flat final. Anyway, nobody would buy that old house, and I sure as hell won't move back here to live in it. Tapping the documents in the open file folder, Kadinska said, The house has little value, you're right. But the house and its contents aren't the meat of this inheritance, Joey. There's more than $250,000 in liquid assets, certificates of deposit, and money market accounts. Joey's mouth went punk dry. His heart began to pound fiercely. The lawyer's office harbored a terrible darkness of which he had been dangerously unaware, and now it was rising up around him. That's crazy. Dad was a poor man. But your brother has been a success for a long time now. For about 14 years, he's been sending your father a check every month, just like clockwork, $1,000. I told you how it drove PJ crazy that your dad wouldn't spend more than a little of it. Dan pretty much just banked check after check, and through what bankers like to call the miracle of compound interest, the principal has grown. Joey's voice was shaky. That's not my money. That belongs to PJ. It came from him. It should go back to him. But your father left it to you, all to you, and his will is a legal document. Give it to PJ when he shows up, Joey insisted, and he headed for the office door. I suspect PJ will want whatever your dad wanted. He'll say you should keep it all. I won't. "I won't," Joey said, raising his voice. Kadinska caught up with him in the reception lounge, took him by the arm, and halted him. "Joey, it's not that easy." "Sure it is." "If you really don't want it, then you have to renounce the inheritance." "I renounce it. I already did. Don't want it." "A document has to be drawn, signed, notarized." Although the day was cold and the office was on the chilly side, Joey had broken into a sweat. "How long will it take to put these papers together?" "If you'll come back tomorrow afternoon, "No." Joey's heart was jackhammering almost hard enough to shatter the ribs and breastbone that caged it. "No, sir. I'm not staying here another night. I'm going to Scranton. A flight to Pittsburgh in the morning, Vegas from there, all the way out to Vegas. Mail me the papers." "That's probably better anyway," Kadinska said. "It'll give you more time to think, to reconsider." At first the lawyer had seemed to be a gentle, bookish man. Not now. Joey no longer saw kindness in the man's eyes. Instead, he perceived the slyness of a bargainer for souls, something with scales under the disguise of skin, with eyes that in a different light would be like the sulphur yellow eyes of the dog that had confronted him on the front porch a while ago. He wrenched loose of the attorney's hand, shoved him aside, and made for the outer door in a state close to panic. Kadinska called after him, "Joey, what's wrong?" The hallway, past the real estate office, the dentist, toward the stairs. He wanted desperately to be out in the fresh air, to be washed clean by the rain. "Joey, what's the matter with you?" "Stay away from me," he shouted. When he reached the head of the stairs, he halted so abruptly that he almost pitched to the bottom. He grabbed the newel post to keep his balance. At the foot of the steep stairs lay the dead blonde, bundled in a transparent tarp partly opaque with blood. The plastic was drawn tightly across her bare breasts, compressing them. Her nipples were visible, but not her face. One pale arm had slipped out of her shroud. Although she was dead, she reached out beseechingly. He could not bear the sight of her mangled hand, the blood, the nail hole in her delicate palm. Most of all, he was terrified that she would speak to him from behind her plastic veil, and that he would be told things that he shouldn't know, mustn't know. With a whimper like that of a cornered animal, he turned from her and started back the way he had come. "Joey." Henry Kadinska stood in the dimly lighted hall ahead of him. Shadows seemed to be drawn to the attorney, except for his thick eyeglasses, which blazed with reflections of the yellow light overhead. He was blocking the way, approaching, eager to have another chance to offer his bargain. Now, frantic for fresh air and cleansing rain, Joey spun away from Kadinska and returned to the stairs. The blonde still sprawled below, her arm extended, her hand open, silently pleading for something, perhaps for mercy. "Joey!" Kadinska's voice, close behind him. Joey descended the precipitous flight of stairs hesitantly at first, then faster, figuring that he would step over her if she was really there, kick at her if she tried to seize him, down 2 stairs at a time, not even holding onto the handrail, barely keeping his balance, a third of the way, halfway, and still she was there, now 8 steps below, 6, 4, and she was reaching out to him, the red stigmata glistening in the center of her palm. He screamed as he reached the last step, and the dead woman vanished when he cried out. He plunged through the space that she had occupied, crashed through the door, and staggered onto the sidewalk in front of the Old Town Tavern. He turned his face up into the Pabst blue and rolling rock green rain, which was so cold that it might soon turn to sleet. In seconds he was soaked, but he didn't feel entirely clean. In the rental car again, he fumbled the flask out from under the driver's seat where he'd tucked it earlier. The rain had not cleansed him inside. He had breathed in corruption, swallowed it. Blended whiskey offered considerable antiseptic power. He unscrewed the cap from the flask and took a long swallow, then another. Choking on the spirits, gasping for breath, he replaced the cap, afraid that he would drop the flask and waste the precious ounces that it still contained. Kadinska hadn't followed him out into the storm, but Joey didn't want to delay another moment. He started the car, pulled away from the curb, splashed through a flooded intersection, and drove along Main Street toward the end of town. He didn't believe that he would be allowed to leave. Something would stop him. The car would sputter, stall, and refuse to start. Cross-traffic would crash into him at an intersection, even though the streets seemed deserted. Lightning would strike a telephone pole and drop it across the road. Something would prevent him from getting out of town. He was in the grip of a superstition that he could not shake or explain. In spite of his dire expectations, he reached the town line and crossed it. Main Street became the county road. Forests and fields replaced the huddled and depressed buildings of Asherville. Still shuddering as much from fear as from having been soaked by the rain, he drove at least a mile before he began to realize how strangely he had reacted to the prospect of receiving $250,000. He had no idea why a sudden windfall should have terrified him, why a stroke of good fortune should instantly convince him that his soul was in peril. After all, Considering how he had lived his life thus far, he was doomed to hell anyway if it existed. 3 miles outside Asherville, Joey came to a three-way stop. Directly ahead of him, beyond the rural intersection, the county route continued, a glistening black ribbon dwindling down a long, gradual slope into the early twilight. To the left was Coal Valley Road, leading to the town of Coal Valley. On that Sunday night 20 years ago, when he had been on his way back to college, he had planned to take Coal Valley Road 12 miles through the mountains until it connected with the old state 3-lane that the locals called Black Hollow Highway, then go west 9 miles to the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He always went that way because it was the shortest route. But on that night, for reasons he had never since been able to recall, he had driven past Coal Valley Road. He'd followed the county route, another 19 miles to the interstate, and had taken the interstate to a roundabout loop toward Black Hollow Highway and the Turnpike. On the interstate he'd had the accident, and thereafter nothing had ever gone right for him again. He had been driving his 10-year-old 65 Ford Mustang, which he had salvaged and restored with his dad's help from an auto junkyard after the original owner had rolled it. God, how he had loved that car. It had been the only thing of beauty he had ever owned, and most important, his own hands had brought it back from ruin to glory. Recalling the Mustang, he hesitantly touched the left side of his forehead, above his eye and just below the hairline. The scar was an inch long, barely visible, but easily felt. He remembered the sickening slide, his car spinning on the rain-slick interstate, the collision with the signpost, the shattering window. He remembered all the blood. Now he sat at the three-way stop, staring down Coal Valley Road to his left, and he knew that if he took this route, as he should have taken it on that eventful night long ago, he would at last have a chance to put everything right. He would get his life back on track. That was a crazy notion. Perhaps as superstitious as his earlier certainty that fate would not allow him to drive out of Asherville, but this time he was right. It was true. He had no doubt that he was being given another chance. He knew that some superhuman power was at work in the fading October twilight, knew that the meaning of his troubled life lay along that 2-lane mountain route, because Coal Valley Road had been condemned and torn up more than 19 years ago, yet now it waited to his left, exactly as it had been on that special night. It was magically restored. Chapter 7. Joey eased the rental Chevy past the stop sign and parked on the narrow shoulder on the dead-end side of the three-way intersection, directly across from the entrance to Coal Valley Road. He switched off the headlights but left the engine running. Overhung by autumnal trees, those 2 lanes of wet blacktop led out of the deepening twilight and vanished into shadows as black as the oncoming night. The pavement was littered with colorful leaves that glowed strangely in the gloom as though irradiated. His heart pounded. He closed his eyes and listened to the rain. When at last he opened his eyes, he half expected that Coal Valley Road wouldn't be there anymore, that it had been just one more hallucination. But it hadn't vanished. The 2 lanes of blacktop glistened with silver rain. Scarlet and amber leaves glimmered like a scattering of jewels meant to lure him into the tunnel of trees and into the deeper darkness beyond. Impossible. But there it was. 21 years ago in Coal Valley, a 6-year-old boy named Rudy DeMarco had tumbled into a sinkhole that abruptly opened under him while he was playing in his backyard. Rushing out of the house in response to her son's screams, Mrs. DeMarco had found him in an 8-foot deep pit, with sulphurous smoke billowing from fissures in the bottom. She scrambled into the hole after him into heat so intense that she seemed to have descended through the gates of hell. The floor of the pit resembled a furnace grate. Little Rudy's legs were trapped between thick bars of stone, dangling into whatever inferno was obscured by the rising smoke. Choking, dizzy, instantly disoriented, Mrs. DeMarco nevertheless wrenched her child from the gap in which he was wedged. As the unstable floor of the pit quaked and cracked and crumbled under her, she dragged Rudy to the sloped wall, clawed at the hot earth, and frantically struggled upward. The bottom dropped out altogether. The sinkhole rapidly widened. The treacherous slope slid away beneath her, but still she pulled her boy out of the seething smoke and onto the lawn. His clothes were ablaze. She covered him with her body, trying to smother the flames, and her clothes caught on fire. Clutching Rudy against her, she rolled with him in the grass, crying for help, and her screams seemed especially loud because her boy had fallen silent. More than his clothes had burned, most of his hair was singed away, one side of his face was blistered, and his small body was charred. 3 days later, in a Pittsburgh hospital to which he had been taken by air ambulance, Rudy DeMarco died of catastrophic burns. For 16 years prior to the boy's death, the people of Coal Valley had lived above a subterranean fire that churned relentlessly through a network of abandoned mines, eating away at untapped veins of anthracite, gradually widening those underground corridors and shafts. While state and federal officials debated whether the hidden conflagration would eventually burn itself out, while they argued about various strategies for extinguishing it, while they squandered fortunes on consultants and interminable hearings, while they strove indefatigably to shift the financial responsibility for the cleanup from one jurisdiction to another, Coal Valley's residents lived with carbon monoxide monitors to avoid being gassed in the night by mine fire fumes that seeped up through the foundations of their homes. Scattered across the town were vent pipes, tapping the tunnels below to release smoke from the fire and perhaps minimize a buildup of toxic gases in nearby houses, one even thrust up from the elementary school playground. With the tragic death of little Rudy DeMarco, the politicians and bureaucrats were at last compelled to take action. The federal government purchased the threatened properties, beginning with those houses directly over the most hotly burning tunnels, then those over secondary fires, then those that were still only adjacent to the deep combustible rivers of coal. During the course of the following years, homes were condemned, and as the residents moved away, the reasonably pleasant village of Coal Valley gradually became a ghost town. By that rainy night in a long-ago October, when Joey had taken the wrong road back to college, only 3 families remained in Coal Valley. They had been scheduled to move out before Thanksgiving. In the year that followed the departure of those last residents, bulldozers were to knock down every building in the village. Every scrap of the demolished structures were to be hauled away. The streets, cracked and hoved from the pressures of the hidden fires below, would be torn up. The hills and fields would be seeded with grass, restoring the land to something resembling a natural state, and the mine fires would be left to burn, some said for 100 or 200 years, until the veins of coal were at last exhausted. Geologists, mining engineers, and officials from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources believed that the fire would eventually undermine 4,000 acres, an area far greater than that encompassed by the abandoned village. Consequently, Coal Valley Road was likely to suffer sudden subsidence at numerous points along much of its length, a deadly danger to motorists. More than 19 years ago, therefore, after the ghost town had been demolished and hauled away, Coal Valley Road had been torn up as well. It had not been there when he had driven into Asherville the previous day. Now it waited, leading out of the rain-twilight into an unknown night. The road not taken. Joey was holding the flask again. Although he had opened it, he had no memory of unscrewing the cap. If he drank what remained of the Jack Daniels, the road that led into the dark tunnel of trees might blur, fade, and finally vanish. Perhaps it was wise not to pin any hopes on miraculous second chances and supernatural redemption. For all he knew, if he put the Chevy in gear and followed that strange highway, he would be changing his life not for better, but for worse. He brought the flask to his lips. Thunder rolled through a cold heaven. The rataplan of rain swelled until he could not even hear the idling car engine. The whiskey fumes smelled as sweet as salvation. Rain. Rain, torrential rain. It washed the last light out of the bleak day. Although he was beyond the touch of the rain, the heavy pall of descending darkness was inescapable. Night entered the car, a familiar companion with whom he had passed uncountable lonely hours in troubled contemplation of a life gone wrong. He and the night had finished many bottles of whiskey together, and eventually he had always been granted the surcease of sleep, if nothing else. All he had to do was put the flask against his lips, tip it, and drain the few ounces that it still contained, whereupon this dangerous temptation to embrace hope would surely pass. The mysterious highway would vanish, and then he could get on with a life that, although lacking hope, could be passed in a safe, blessed anesthetic haze. He sat for a long time, wanting a drink, not drinking. Joey wasn't aware of the car approaching along the county road behind him until its headlights suddenly shot through the back window of the Chevy. A virtual explosion of light shattered over him, as though from an onrushing locomotive with one giant blazing cyclopean eye. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but winced and looked away as the bright reflection stung his eyes. The car roared past him and hung a hard left onto Coal Valley Road. It cast up such a heavy plume of dirty water from the puddled pavement that it was impossible for Joey to see any details of it or get a glimpse of its driver. As the spray washed down the side window of the Chevy and the glass cleared again, the other vehicle slowed. Its taillights dwindled until it had gone perhaps 100 yards along the colonnade of trees, where it came to a full stop on the roadway. "No," Joey said. Out there on Coal Valley Road, the red brake lights were like the radiant eyes of a demon in a dream, frightening but compelling, alarming but mesmerizing. No. He turned his head and stared at the Nightcloak County Road in front of him, the route that he'd taken 20 years ago. It had been the wrong highway then, but it was the right one now. After all, he wasn't headed back to college as he had been that night. Now he was 40 years old and bound for Scranton, where he had to catch a commuter flight to Pittsburgh in the morning. On Coal Valley Road, the taillights glowed. The strange car waited. Scranton, Pittsburgh, Vegas, the trailer park, a shabby but safe little life. No hope, but no nasty surprises either. Red brake lights. Beacons. Shimmering in the deluge. Joey capped the flask without drinking from it. He switched on the headlights and put the Chevy in gear. "Jesus help me," he said. He drove across the intersection and on to Coal Valley Road. Ahead of him, the other car began to move again. It quickly picked up speed. Joey Shannon followed the phantom driver through a veil between reality and some other place, toward a town that no longer existed, toward a fate beyond understanding.